Hello, everybody. Welcome in to another edition of Tunnel Vision, a show presented to you by USCFootball.com. I'm your host, Jack Smith, joined in studio by Connor Morrissette, and we are here to preview USC's game on Saturday against Minnesota. Third conference game in the Big Ten for USC, and the second time they'll go on the road as they search their first Big Ten win away from the Coliseum. We'll talk about the game. We'll recap a little bit of the Wisconsin game this past weekend as USC grabbed a 38-21 win. We'll preview the USC game against Minnesota, and we'll take any and all questions that you guys have wherever you're watching the podcast, whether that is on YouTube or Facebook. You can leave your comments, your questions. We can put them on the screen, answer your questions at the end of the show, and you guys can chime in periodically, and we'll be able to throw it up on the screen and allow you guys to influence the conversation a little bit. But thank you guys so much for tuning in. If you're here, make sure to hit the like button, the subscribe button, and leave those comments. But Connor, USC takes on Minnesota this weekend. It's not a completely new opponent for USC, but certainly a newer one of recent years. And we're going to have a lot of that this year where USC plays a team that it hasn't played in a while. You kind of have to refamiliarize yourself with a program. For USC, it's the first time in around 12, 13 years.
New team for sure, but kind of similar to Wisconsin, in my opinion, Jack. I don't think the game plan from like a 10,000-foot view changes a ton when looking at Minnesota and Wisconsin. Of course, they're different teams, but there are some similarities there where on offense, there isn't that one player outside of maybe Darius Taylor, their running back for Minnesota, who you really have to stop and say, okay, that's a surefire top of the first, maybe even second round, day one or day two NFL draft guy. Minnesota's a team that is talented. Defensively, certainly, they have some numbers that are in their favor where you look at the passing defense, they're number one in passing yards allowed. Their schedule has really helped with that, but it's a defense that you have to take seriously. But the overarching point and what I want to try to convey on the show today is if USC is the team that we think they are, Minnesota can certainly beat you if you don't play your best football, but if USC plays its best football and does what it's done when we've seen USC play really well this season, this is certainly a winnable game and a game I expect them to win for sure.
Andrew on the YouTube chat says, Connor's looking jacked. Is that a Schmedium shirt? Did you get in on the Benny Wiley training program during the offseason? Were you part of that 1,400-pound weight gain?
Thank you. No, I did hear Benny Wiley say it's Squat-tober coming out to practice the other day, though. If you could see my legs, you wouldn't think I was
going to say, it's a good thing you can't see out of our legs.
But thank you for the compliment.
Well, USC will, as people have talked about, need that size that they put on during the offseason to play in some of these Big Ten games. I don't think Minnesota fits that bill exactly as a team that you're scared of in the trenches. I'd say in terms of Big Ten play, they're probably right around the middle, probably in the bottom half in terms of trench warfare. And I think a group that USC probably matches up with. If you're looking at, what's USC like size-wise, power-wise, in the trenches, moving into the Big Ten, you profile them probably closer to a team like Minnesota than you would obviously Michigan or in Iowa. So I'm not sure that this is a game that USC fans have to be really concerned about USC getting pushed around. Would you kind of agree with that in terms of talking about this Minnesota team on the line of scrimmage?
Definitely. I think they're competent, but it's not a Michigan where they have the number one pass rushing grade according to Pro Football Focus on the year. That whole defensive line is loaded with NFL prospects. It's just a little bit of a different opponent. I think the Minnesota left tackle is pretty good. He's a NFL guy, but they don't really consistently have that on either sides of the ball. He's really the only marquee lineman. The right tackle is pretty solid too. But it's just different, Jack. And yeah, I do agree with you. I think it's a matchup that USC should take advantage of. I jotted it down here. Minnesota's allowed 15 sacks this year, which is 107th nationally. USC, they haven't really gotten too many sacks this year, so this could be an opportunity for them to do that a little bit. Lincoln Riley addressed that today, and he said, we're happy with the pass rush. Of course, we want to get more sacks, and it could be better, but we have been affecting the quarterback. Look at the third down numbers. Look at the fourth down numbers. D'Anton Lynn said the same thing. And when you're winning football games like USC has been doing, and, of course, one play away from being undefeated right now, it's kind of hard to really nitpick too much. That's an area a lot of people have talked about, the USC defensive line, and looking at this Minnesota offensive line, I do think it's a unit that USC should have some success against. If they don't get a bunch of sacks, though, can they still win this game? Absolutely.
I think as a example of why sacks are probably an overrated stat, if you look back at USC's defense to start last year, when they had that 6-0 start, there was, I believe, around week 5, USC was leading the nation in sacks. Does that mean they were a good defense, Connor, last year? Like, they were a pretty bad defense last year. So again, sacks don't mean everything. You can be aggressive and get sacks, but give up big plays, and that was kind of the hallmark at times of the Alex Grinch defense. Right now, USC's been able to be aggressive, impact the quarterback, and still play strong behind however many guys they rush. So for any USC fans, and I understand, I think, a little bit when you are looking at a box score and you don't see sacks, you think that there's no pressure or no pass rush getting home. I would just say pump the brakes a little bit on that talk. Look at things other than sacks like pressures. But at the same time, I do think there's a happy medium as well, where I'm not saying you have to sack the quarterback 5 times a game, but USC probably still isn't getting home to the quarterback as many times per game as they should. And maybe that is, they've played 2 amazing offensive lines in LSU and Michigan. They played a pretty good Wisconsin offensive line, and the one game that they played against an inferior offensive line, they did get home against Utah State. So maybe it's a scheduling thing so far, but I'd say pump the brakes on calling off this defense because they're not getting home to the quarterback at all.
Certainly. Just look at what USC's done this season, and fans listening to this will say, we know the defense is good. You don't have to explain it to us. The sacks, it doesn't tell the whole story, to your point. Going back to Minnesota for a second, though, Jack, I seem confident, and I really like USC's chances, but they are a team that can make you pay if you don't bring your A game. If USC plays the first half like they did against Wisconsin on the road, they did come back against Michigan, but I just wonder, is that sustainable? Can you come back week in and week out? If they lay an egg in the first half, can Minnesota maybe jump out and steal this game? Absolutely, because their quarterback, Max Brosmer, he is a solid player. He's probably the second best quarterback USC has faced so far this season. The receiving core isn't fantastic, but they've made some plays against Michigan, and they can make you pay if you don't bring your A game. Like Vinny Anthony, that Wisconsin receiver, did anyone expect him to score that long touchdown against Jacoby Covington? No. Minnesota has guys like him who can make you pay. The running game is solid. What I like, though, for USC, looking at that Minnesota offense, they don't have those explosive players outside of, like I said, maybe Darius Taylor. But what killed you against Michigan, allowing those long explosive runs? What hurt you against Wisconsin when things weren't going well? That big pass play down the left sideline, and then after the Zachariah Branch muff, immediately allowing an 18-yard run. I just look at this Minnesota offense. A lot needs to go right for them to score points, and they might get an explosive play here or there, but I don't anticipate a situation like we saw against Michigan where, boom, it's 3 explosive runs, 2 go for touchdowns, 1 sets up another one. I don't know if they're capable of doing that against the USC defense that I've seen so far this season.
Yeah, and Taylor is one of the better running backs that USC will face this year, and that's saying a lot because they're going to see a lot of really good ones and already have seen a bunch of good ones, especially with Khalil Mullings at Michigan. But the run game in general for Minnesota isn't as strong as you'd assume it is with a good running back. Like, just because you have a good back in the backfield doesn't mean your run game is automatically going to be good. And I know PJ Fleck has talked about that at early points in this season. The offensive line has been okay, good. I mean, allowing 15 sacks isn't good, and obviously they're able to run a little bit, and Darius Taylor will make plays himself. But unlike when USC played Michigan, and it felt like whenever Khalil Mullings was ready for a big play, the offensive line would block it up for him, and even if they didn't, he would make a big play. It does seem like Minnesota this year, a lot of the good runs have come when Darius Taylor's making it himself, not when the rush offense is just completely paving the way for easy gains in big games and big games.
Absolutely. They're averaging 2.69 line yards per rush, which ranks 105th in FBS, which that combines how well your offensive line is doing and your running back, and it's the lowest of the PJ Fleck era. That just goes to show how poorly they've been running the ball so far, even though they have had some plays where it's like, okay, Darius Taylor looks pretty good here. The Colorado transfer, Mangum, he doesn't get a ton of carries, but he leads them in yards per rush. Marcus Major is another guy to pay attention to. They have guys who can beat you, but the whole operation so far this season, what PJ Fleck really wants to do is run the ball to set up the pass, and that running game just hasn't been there. And USC's rush defense has been awesome. We all remember the LSU game where their left tackle says, we're going to run the ball, and I want the world to know it. And then in the fourth quarter, I think they rushed for 2 yards, and USC just shut them down. So it's a run defense that should be able to stop this Minnesota team. Again, that's why they play the game. On paper, games aren't won and lost. You got to go prove it on the field. There's a lot to like with this matchup for USC if they can take care of business.
Yeah, and I think at its best, this Minnesota roster is solid. And I feel like that's what you're going to get with PJ Fleck. I think he says all the right things. I think he builds a really good culture, and I have no doubt that that locker room is really connected. But I think looking at the talent of this Minnesota team, you probably rank it as a less talented roster than Wisconsin, certainly less talented than LSU and Michigan. So again, it's one of those games where USC loses if it makes a bunch of mistakes, it can't handle the road environment, and it gives too many opportunities to a less talented Minnesota team.
This isn't the podcast of champions, so we don't have to talk too much about Big Ten rosters. I think Minnesota's probably a little better than Wisconsin, and they've just played tougher opponents so far. I like their quarterback better. The offensive line probably favors Wisconsin, but I don't think that Wisconsin line is tremendous. Defensively, I see a lot of similarities there. I think Minnesota probably has more weapons, but to your point, it's close. It's not like Minnesota has this awesome roster and there are all these guys up and down that we need to be talking about. Defensively, it's a very experienced group, even though they have a new coordinator. Lincoln Riley talked about it this week. A lot of those guys have starts. I like their linebacking core. Those guys frighten me a little bit. They do have a lot of interceptions this season, even though some of their starters in the secondary have been banged up. They haven't faced a passing attack anything like USC, though, so I think those passing defense statistics that are so good for them will, of course, be adjusted after this game. And I'm excited to see what USC can do passing the ball against a Minnesota defense that really it's been ground and pound. That's the way to beat them. Michigan did it. Iowa did it. USC just plays offense in a different way. And Minnesota right now, their pass defense looks really good, but they just haven't played any good quarterbacks so far. So what does it look like against USC? Something's got to give here, and I like USC's chances in that regard too.
Yeah, and Minnesota fans I know are boasting that stat, the number one pass defense in college football. They played a Michigan team last week with Alex Orji, who we saw with our own eyes can't quite really throw the football.
Through one of the worst picks I've ever seen against Minnesota.
Yeah, they've played Nevada, they've played Iowa, notoriously not a big passing team, and then I'm missing some of the other teams on their schedule. But you look and it's like that team doesn't have a quarterback, that team never throws,
Rhode
that
Island,
team can't throw.
that team's FCS.
Yeah. So I would say it's a little bit of a mirage looking at that number and just saying, okay, they've got the best pass defense in college football. No, to this point in the season, they've allowed the fewest passing yards, or other teams have thrown for the fewest amount of yards against them. I don't think they have played a team that's in the same stratosphere as USC in terms of passing the ball, because USC right now is the number one pass offense in the Big Ten. And that's because they are a little bit different, I think, than some of these other teams. But Ohio State likes to throw the ball. Oregon likes to throw the ball. I mean, Dylan Gabriel's out there throwing it 40 times a game. USC is still the number one pass offense in the Big Ten. And Connor, I would say that is the case despite the fact I don't feel like USC has come close to its ceiling yet in terms of the passing offense. With Mekhi Lemon missing last week, haven't really gotten him going in the games that he has played this season. Zachariah Branch, I think, is coming into his own a little bit, but definitely still hasn't reached his ceiling. And USC just unlocked Jacoby Lane over the last couple of weeks, and I think Deuce Robinson is trending up. So USC is right now passing the ball all around the yard, despite the fact I don't think they've gotten all of their weapons going yet, and they all have a ton of room to grow.
North Carolina is maybe the only team that would be, and they're not close to USC. But
that team got destroyed by James Madison.
Yeah, they're not that great. But their quarterback, who was this heralded transfer, ended up getting hurt in the game. But before he got hurt, he was only 12 of 19 for 71 yards and a pick. It's not like USC is going to be able to do anything they want in this game. That was about a month ago at this point now. But you're looking at the schedule, and I'm trying to find a comp. And outside of North Carolina, you really can't. To your point about the USC receivers, Jack, I wrote about Jacoby Lane and how USC might have found their number one option against Wisconsin last week, with Lane catching 10 passes for 105 yards and 2 touchdowns. And that upset a lot of USC fans. People don't like to put that number one label on a receiver. And I understand, because that position, there's Chad Ochocinco and there's guys in the NFL, at least there used to be, that number one receiver that can sort of be a diva situation, and USC, they want to avoid that. I do think it's important to establish a gotta-have-it guy, and it looks like Lane might be trending that way. A big story this week, the development of those sophomore receivers. Like you said, they're taking steps. Maybe one guy has a great game one week, another guy has another good game the following week. They haven't really put it all together so far. Mekhi Lemon's been out a little bit. Zachariah Branch, of course, has had some issues on special teams, a couple drops here and there. I'm excited to see what they look like because I think this is another big week for them where USC, we know they're going to throw the ball a lot. Those guys with Mekhi Lemon back in the lineup too are going to get a lot of opportunities. Let's see what it looks like gearing up for Penn State a week after. Don't want to look too far ahead, but that's a game where you're going to need all hands on deck.
Yeah, I would agree. And just going back to the Minnesota team, I think that, again, they're solid. I would preview this as another week where USC has the advantage, and if they're the team that we think they are, they need to go in and handle business, because we've talked about the 12-team college football playoff where you could probably afford to lose one of the Penn State or Notre Dame games. But this is one of those games where, like, you lose this one and you probably don't have a chance to make the playoff unless you run the table, and that just it looks harder and harder with the schedule USC has down the stretch. But you can lump this game in, I would say, with the Rutgers game at home and going to Washington and going to Maryland. Like, these are the games that good USC teams would win. And I think that this team is good enough to go in there, handle business, win semi-comfortably, and we'll have our picks against the spread at the end of the show. But all these games start to feel a little bit similar, and maybe that's just because we're learning these Big Ten teams and seeing them for the first time, and once we're a couple years into the conference, we'll be able to differentiate them and remember the teams of the past. But Minnesota does kind of feel like your average Big Ten team. They're in the blend. You could put them in different uniforms, and you wouldn't really be able to tell what program it is. That is the way it feels to me right now when you're looking at Minnesota compared to some of these teams on USC's schedule.
I totally agree with that. Very similar to Wisconsin, like we've talked about. Pretty similar to Rutgers.
Yeah, like they're all, you could just put them in a different uniform, and it's like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. That could be Wisconsin.
Iowa has a better defense than those teams, but similar identity there. Nebraska probably has the best quarterback of the group in Dylan Raiola, even though he's young and up and down at times, but they're similar identity, so totally get what you're saying. Even Notre Dame kind of has that identity, and they're not in the Big Ten. I do wonder, Jack, how Minnesota is going to respond after, let's say, getting screwed against Michigan. The Big Ten changes how they officiate onside kicks after they were called for being offside on an onside kick that they recovered, which was not offside. Tough break for them. They were down 3, had all the momentum, and that game was stolen away from them. The Big Ten didn't come out and officially say that, but they changed how they officiate the onside kick now, and I believe the director of officiating did tell PJ Fleck that they made a mistake, and then Fleck said that. So is that going to make them angry, and now they'll come out 0-2 in the Big Ten and really punch USC in the mouth, or will they be like, well, hey, we got screwed last week, still fixating on that? I know Fleck, he's a mentality monster, and he's going to try to get the most out of his guys and get them to focus. But you wonder if that lingers a little bit, and just what kind of Minnesota team is USC going to get. I think they're going to be hungry, and I think they're going to come out guns blazing at 0-2 in the conference. It's a must-win game for them, and USC, to get to the goals that they want to get to this year, they want to accomplish. It's a must-win game in that area. So if I'm a neutral, I'm excited for this game, not because maybe the X's and O's matchup is so good or they're fantastic players on the Minnesota side that you want to see how they match up against USC, but just from a desperation standpoint at home, a game Minnesota needs, how are they going to respond after getting a tough break against Michigan, and how does USC answer to that?
I think we assumed that USC would come out guns blazing after the loss to Michigan, feeling like, man, we almost had it. Now we just need to come and punish Wisconsin. And I felt like they were almost pressing to do that in the Coliseum this past weekend in the first half. And that 20-minute break at halftime probably did a pretty good job of resetting them. It was like, we're trying too hard right now. We're pushing the envelope. We're forcing the issue. We need to get back to fundamentals, come out, and play well in the second half. So there's a chance, too, that like they're going to be so amped, like, man, we lost to Michigan. We need to beat USC now. We need to prove to everybody we're still good. And sometimes when you come out with too much of that emotion, you're trying to be something you're not. You're doing too much, and you give the ball to the other team, or you make a mistake because you're trying to make a play on a football, something like that. You allow a big play because you're too aggressive. So it's a double-edged sword, and I always think that's one of the beauties of football is like you have to find the medium between really want to be aggressive, want to come out, show who we are, and got to stick to our fundamentals. Don't try and do too much. Just be who we are. And I think that's really interesting to see how Minnesota handles that kind of paradigm this weekend.
We saw USC press a little bit. Branch has the muff punt.
Yeah.
Miller Moss was under pressure on his interception, but that to me felt like him forcing a throw and feeling like he needed to make a play. And against Michigan, Minnesota pretty much gifted the Wolverines 2 touchdowns. They had a bad fumble where their receivers fighting for yards, and then they had a blocked punt in this game. It's college football. So much comes down to who makes fewer mistakes in these games, and you can overcome mistakes, as we've seen with USC at times this season. The better team oftentimes does, but sometimes if you just make one too many, especially on the road, you're in a real tough spot. So I think watching both of these teams a little bit closely this week and watching USC closely, of course, the whole season, when the Trojans have made those costly errors, you think of the pick six against Michigan, and then you think of Zachariah Branch muffing a punt. They overcame one of those, but on the road, it's a whole different beast. Minnesota made some mistakes on the road. You just have to avoid making those mistakes on the road. It's a little bit easier to overcome them at home, and that's something I'll be looking for with USC too, because that pick six that Moss threw against Michigan, don't want to blame him for the loss solely. Of course, it's not on him, but they really could have used those 6 points because the extra point they get blocked at the end of the game, lose it by 3.
Yeah, and I think for as much credit as we give USC for being a resilient team that makes second half adjustments and comes out and doesn't give up, you can give a lot of that same credit to Minnesota for the way that it played against Michigan last week. I mean, literally the exact same final score. Both teams lost 27-24 in the Big House. Each team had a different kind of chance to win it, and I know Minnesota fans would probably say that the chance was taken away from them at the end. But
it was.
This is a team that could be similarly resilient to USC, which that's the word I would use right now to describe the first 4 games we've seen from the Trojans.
Certainly, they have shown that, especially the last 2 weeks. I mean, both Minnesota and USC against Michigan in that second half could have not packed it in, and just said, hey, this defensive line, we're having trouble with those guys. Minnesota, Brosmer was sacked 4 times in the first half against Michigan too. So that was another question I had leaving the Michigan game. We saw how well Texas's offensive line did but against Michigan, but was that just Texas's offensive line being great? And is Michigan going to really run everyone else's offensive line off the field? And that's sort of what's happened. It wasn't USC exclusively having issues with that offensive line, but both teams answered in the Big House, and that's a big part of this sport too. And you got to show resilience. And USC the last 2 weeks has done it, but I think most Trojan fans are hoping for a quicker start and to avoid needing to be so resilient this week after some disappointing starts the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, and one last point on Minnesota is something Shotgun brought up earlier this week in the Helium Boys podcast. Minnesota gets a lot of credit for being a culture team. PJ Fleck gets a lot of credit for being a program builder. Minnesota has lost 7 straight games to Power 5 opponents dating back to last year. That's a streak USC can't afford to end. USC needs to beat Minnesota. You can give credit to Minnesota and hype up some of the things that the program does well, but it's also a program that hasn't beaten a Power 5 team in the last basically year of games. So you got to go in and win the game.
So I hear what you're saying there. That's a team that did almost beat Michigan at Michigan. I get what you're saying, Jack. And I mean, they have to win the game regardless if they want to reach their goal, which is the college football playoff. So I don't disagree with you there. I think that stat paints Minnesota in a worse light than maybe they're in. But, hey, PJ Fleck, he posted back-to-back 9-win seasons, and then last year 6-7, so they came back to life a little bit. And we can get into talking about him a little bit. Did you see what he did with, I guess they do it every road game, they bring some dirt from their own stadium and they pour it in their stadium that they're visiting, and then they all spit on it and stomp on it, and it's a team bonding thing. Fleck, he's had some success at Minnesota, but I just wonder with him, man, the longer he is there, and players from the high school ranks to college, eventually his shtick has to get old, and that maybe we're seeing that play out, and that might have something to do with that stat that you gave. He clearly is a good motivator, and his guys love him, but I just wonder a little bit if his shtick is getting old, because I mean, he's a hardo's hardo, that's for sure.
Yeah, not to bring up a name that USC fans don't want to hear very often, but I think PJ Fleck's on that Clay Helton train. I think everyone likes him. He says all the right things. You don't look at PJ Fleck and say, that's a guy I dislike. No one across the country has a vendetta against PJ Fleck. No one from other programs is man, I just really don't like PJ Fleck. I don't like to see PJ Fleck succeed. Everyone's that's PJ Fleck. He's cool. Row the boat. I like what he's done wherever he's gone, but he just doesn't win. They haven't really won a ton under PJ
Well,
Fleck.
they went 11-2 one year.
Yeah, well, okay. Clay Helton won a Rose Bowl.
Well, yeah, but that's USC where you're recruiting out of your butt and you can get anyone.
I get it. I don't know. I think PJ Fleck it's a lot of the stuff that happens off the field. It's building culture, but when push comes to shove, I'm not sure. And I know it's Minnesota, so I don't are you getting someone better? But I just don't know about where he stands going forward and whether he's great for the future of the Minnesota football program. There was a 247 article that came out this week about the odds on the first coach fired in America. I want to say he was one of the 5 worst odds in the country. Dave Aranda was number 1, Billy Napier was number 2, and you didn't have to go further down the list to find PJ Fleck in Minnesota.
That's interesting. I feel like if I'm a UCLA fan, I'd kill for PJ Fleck to be my head coach right now.
They should want Justin Wilcox.
Well, yeah, he'd probably be pretty good too. Would he go though? I feel like Minnesota to UCLA, maybe not. I guess Cal's probably UCLA is an upgrade if I'm saying Minnesota is. But to me, I just like that what you're getting and you're probably going to win 6 games. And at Minnesota, could you maybe do better? But at UCLA right now, they're not going to win maybe 3 this year. So I get what you're saying, and if he has a better chance of being fired than I think, so be it. I didn't see that story. I don't know if you're Minnesota, how much better you can do with this guy. A couple years ago, 2022, he won 9 games. Last year, 6-7. They still made a bowl game. Right now, he's 2-3. But is there one game where it's he deserves to be fired for this game? They were a missed field goal away from beating North Carolina, and then they've had 2 and now a third really tough Big Ten game to start the season. I kind of think he is what he is, and I don't have a huge issue with his success. I think he's a little bit better than Clay Helton, in my opinion, but maybe we can agree to disagree on that.
I mean, you're probably right in that, but I'm just saying, in terms of a guy that, I'm just not sure he's going to get it done. But I don't. And the grass isn't
Minnesota,
always
on a 30-yard kick. No, I'm just kidding.
And I don't think the grass is always greener, and I don't think that coaching college football is not easy. We don't do it. We wouldn't be good at it. But look at Luke Fickell. He was great at Cincinnati. He's semi-struggling at Wisconsin, especially this year with a roster that we saw last week and weren't all that impressed with, and former players like Braylon Allen are tweeting it about how in future years he's going to go on a podcast and he's going to reveal all the dirty secrets about his last year playing at Wisconsin when Luke Fickell had come in and they had Ches Malusi, the running back, step away from the team today. Coaching in college football isn't easy, and sometimes you feel like you've got a slam dunk hire. USC would have felt like that with Luke Fickell in 2021. They would have felt like that with Dave Aranda in 2021. Heck, PJ Fleck was a name that was rumored for the USC job in 2021. So sometimes it's not as simple as plug and play this guy at head coach from the previous school. So you never really know, and maybe you're right that at the very least, PJ Fleck is going to be consistently who he is, and you know that you're never going to be horrible, and you're always going to be at the very worst average.
That's how I see it. But I do wonder, 5 years from now, is he still rowing the boat? Is he still bringing dirt from their field to another field? Are Gen Zers or whatever age, what is it? Whatever, what's the younger one? Gen Z?
Yeah,
what are you,
that's
Jack?
mine.
Yeah.
I'm Gen Z.
Well, what are
Is
college?
it Gen X?
I don't know. Whatever the youngest generation is right now, are you going to look at PJ Fleck and be like, I want to play for that guy? I don't know.
The iGen, the iGen.
I don't know where it starts, where it stops, but kids are different, and eventually, that rah-rah football coach, that's getting old, man.
Well, yeah, especially everyone can just redshirt now and hold out for their NIL money and transfer. We're seeing that more and more. There was another player this week that I saw it today. I forget what school it is. I think it's UCF. A receiver that played pretty well against Colorado last week. He's also redshirting. One of the things that I thought was interesting from this week is Lincoln Riley did kind of address that. There was news that Rajon Davis, the USC linebacker, former top modern-day recruit, he is redshirting this year. Not like Bear Alexander, not likely with the intention of entering the transfer portal, because his father took to Twitter and mentioned they want another year with Matt Entz, the linebacker coach at USC, next year. So Rajon Davis is redshirting. Of course, that has there will be consequences for that in the USC linebacker room, and guys will have to step up behind where Rajon Davis would have been on the depth chart. But Lincoln Riley did mention, I believe it was on Tuesday after practice, he'd like to see the redshirt rule changed. And I said it, I think, last week on this show on a Thursday, that I thought the Bear Alexander, Matthew Sluka, all that stuff on that Wednesday was the day that the redshirt started to get worked away in college football. And it seems like Lincoln Riley's advocating for that as well.
Yeah, what did he say? He wants 5 years.
Yeah,
and
you used to start with 5.
The only way you can get another year is if you have 2 season-ending injuries.
Yeah.
I wonder what that threshold would look like, because if there's a 4-game threshold again, then you're just back in that same situation. So we would need to figure out what a season-ending injury means. But, yeah, that's something to look at with college football. The biggest thing we need, Jack, are contracts that lock these guys in. And if you want to transfer, then you have to agree to end your contract. Maybe it's a buyout. Maybe it's just, hey, you can go, but we're not going to pay what you're owed the rest of the way. Recruiting, it's so funny right now. I don't want to crap on our own industry, but like, hey, why'd you commit to this school? Oh, well, I love the coaching staff. I love the facilities. Oh, yeah, I also got paid a ton of money to go to this school. And that just, no one writes that. And that's a huge reality. I cannot wait for the day number 1 quarterback in the country signs with USC, 3-year, $12 million deal. He's locked in. And then if that player, for whatever reason, doesn't work out in a couple years and decides to transfer, then, okay, well, what's going to happen with their NIL money? Well, they're owed $4 million for this season. They're going to transfer. That's done. If you want to transfer, your contract is automatically void. And to me, it's such an easy solution. I know that people don't want to go that way, especially the NCAA, because that would ruin everything that they're trying to do. But the world of recruiting right now, yeah, I love the facilities. I love the coaching staff. It's money for so many of these top players, and that's not even being talked about, which I think is laughable.
Yeah, I don't have any inside information, but like, how would you feel as a Notre Dame fan right now, seeing your prized recruit in this upcoming class leave for a program that lost to Cal from the SEC and has the coach sitting down in press conferences saying, man, we just need a quarterback that doesn't throw the ball to the other team. And a coach that's getting tweeted at by former players who are just absolutely ripping him. And the guy's like, Auburn, I'm coming home. It's freezing on the plains. Like, you can't tell me there's not money behind Deuce Knight moving from Notre Dame to Auburn. And that just, I know that is the way recruiting is now, and like, we invited this world to come in with the introduction of NIL. And I do think these athletes, for the longest time, have deserved to be paid. But as I said on the phone to my grandma last week, who doesn't understand the situation at all, I was like, I think it's good, but when they brought it in, they needed to put way more rules than they did, and we're dealing with the consequences of that now.
Let's make these bidding wars public. That's what I want. If you want to sign with a school,
like auctions.
Well, not like auctions. Just like, it would be fun to be a reporter too in that space. USC's offering this much for. It sounds crazy because they're high school kids, but like, that's what's happening. So let's just make it public. Let's call a spade a spade. USC's offering this much. This school's offering this much. Maybe you take a little less because you like the coach more. Like, that's where the fun nitty gritty of recruiting should be. This guy took less because he wants to play for Lincoln Riley. He wants to be developed, not, oh, this Notre Dame commit's going to Auburn, and we don't really know if it's money, but of course it's money, but I feel icky. This is so weird. Like, let's just go out, have it all be out in the open, and I'm really excited for that day. Of course, if that day comes, the NCAA is probably out of the picture, and maybe we get the super conference, and there are other things that come along with that. But to me, that's just been a frustration for now a couple years, because just the biggest aspects, of these recruitments are not being discussed at all. Maybe it's little fodder on like a message board, but I'm excited for the day this player signs this deal with this school, and boom, it's all in the open, and let's talk about it. It doesn't have to be some big secret.
Yeah, and then they transfer, and you know exactly how much of that they got and how much it gets voided when they decide to leave the program that they signed a contract with. But enough talk about NIL. It doesn't have anything to do with the game this weekend specifically, but big topic in college football, hot button issue. When you think about USC and this game and the matchup with Minnesota, what are the things that you're looking for from the Trojans this weekend?
I go back to the offensive line, and I was looking at it closely against Wisconsin. I didn't love, of course, the Miller fumble, which Elijah Page goes to block the interior rusher who looked like he was on the edge, but then they send the linebacker late, and Page just didn't pick it up. He made a mistake, and they paid the price, overcame that. That was really the only offensive line play where I was like, you can't do that. That has to be way better. They made a bunch of mistakes, but they were way better than they were against Michigan. Outside of that one play, though, I felt like it was passable. The Deuce Robinson touchdown, Shotgun pointed this out. Like, Lincoln Riley talked about how it was 6 rushing against 5, so there's always going to be an open guy, and then you rewatch the play. It's 3 Wisconsin defensive players just barging at Moss, and USC was able to score on that play anyway. So I'm looking at the offensive line. Long story short, I want to see what they look like on the road. They failed spectacularly on the road against Michigan last time. It's going to be loud here against Minnesota, but of course the personnel on that other side of the line of scrimmage looks a little bit different. Can this line take a step forward? Because to me, Jack, this is really the only part on the team where if USC loses some games that we don't expect them to down the stretch, you can pinpoint, okay, it's probably the offensive line that wasn't good enough, because I think even other parts of the team that could be up and down on certain days, like you're still going to get pretty solid play. The offensive line so far this year has been the only group where it's like, okay, that was awful, and that might cost you a game or two in the future.
Yeah, USC's scoring roughly 35 points per game, and like you're thinking that's pretty good. Lincoln Riley's only had 1 year in his head coaching career when they scored under 40 points per game, his offense, that is. And I just have to go back and think that of all the teams that he's had, this is probably the offensive line that's the least like set in stone, concrete. You know what you're going to get from it. You know going into the season, at the very least, will be serviceable, and we're not going to have tons of busts and mistakes. I mean, USC's starting a true sophomore at left tackle. They can't decide which true sophomore to start and play at right guard. You've got your guard moving to center. You're bringing back a tackle that's been good, okay, but inconsistent, and you're asking him to play multiple tackle spots. I go back to thinking that like this probably shouldn't have been the plan. And I know that they probably want Elijah Page and Alani Noah and Amos Talalele. They know they're the future, so they want them to grow by learning. But this team has a chance to be really good, and I think to be a special team. And I just feel like they probably wish that they could have back the roster construction coming into this year in terms of the offensive line. Because you look at some of these other Big Ten programs, and I think the number one discrepancy right now between USC and these other programs moving into the Big Ten is the way that they work on the offensive line. Michigan had the best offensive line in college football last year, lost all 5 starters to the NFL, and they replaced the line with senior, redshirt senior, senior. USC lost maybe a couple starters. They lost Justin Dedich, who was an undrafted free agent. Michael Tarquin obviously went to Oklahoma, but even at the end of the year, he was embattled and wasn't really a starter. And USC's starting two true sophomores. And I feel like that is where USC is the most dissimilar to these other Big Ten programs. They don't have the stable of a bunch of seniors that come in and have waited their turn for 3 years. Because when you bring in an offensive line recruit, unless they're a 5-star, can't-miss prospect, ones that USC has kind of missed out on in recent years, they probably shouldn't play in their first couple years. And I think that is the area where USC is the most lacking right now in terms of the roster.
I agree with that. Let's see how they develop, though. It's not like there's been an injury to one of the 5 starters where it's like, okay, they're screwed because the guy we expected to play, even if that person wasn't very good, now you're relying on their backup. That was my big concern going into the year about the depth of this group, but everyone is still healthy. So I'm excited to see what it looks like moving forward. And I hate to say you're not going to play someone as tough on the road as Michigan again, but that is the reality.
Yeah.
Penn State will be in the Coliseum, so I want to see what USC looks like against those great edge rushers, and then Notre Dame in the Coliseum as well. So the spot won't be as hard as it was against Michigan ever again. But the mistakes that we saw, or the mistake that we saw against Wisconsin where Page just gets blown by and Moss is strip sacked, like if you want to make the college football playoff, that can't consistently happen. And against LSU, Moss was strip sacked. That was probably more on him a little bit. He had an opportunity to get the ball out of his hand, and he tried to run a little bit, and he was tackled from behind and fumbled. But it's sort of consistently been happening now where he's under too much pressure, and I want to see if this group can develop. I think it's wrong to say right now, oh, they've looked so poor these first 4 games, they're never going to figure it out. It's football. Things can change. They'll develop. They'll get more comfortable with the offense. They can get better, but I need to see it before I'm confident making that declaration.
Yeah, and this year is likely helping the future of the USC offensive line. You're probably you're definitely without Jonah Monheim and Emmanuel Preño next year, I would assume. But that
the 2 best guys, great.
Yeah, you've got if you give Alani Noah or maybe it's Amos Talalele and Elijah Page the time this year, then they come in. You hope maybe other people that are down below are improved by then. But like even then next year, unless they bring in transfers, like USC's again going to be turning to true sophomores as the guys filling in for the players that they lose. And I just think that's a trend that they need to correct. And it's not one you can fix in 1 year, because we've seen them try and build an offensive line through the transfer portal, and I think that's even worse at times. That has not worked for USC over the last couple of years. And so I think Lincoln Riley right now is dealing with a problem that started with the Clay Helton regime, because they didn't recruit offensive line consistently and develop offensive line consistently, although I would say that a lot of the best offensive linemen under Lincoln Riley kind of came from that Clay Helton regime, but they were all the starters that Lincoln Riley inherited. He didn't inherit really anything else below those guys. And, Jonah Monheim's the last one of them. The rest of them are all in the NFL or gone by this point. So it's something that USC obviously can't fix in a year. You can't just recruit a high school kid that's automatically a junior. But I think in terms of if you're looking at big picture, what does USC need to do in the next 5 years to match themselves with some of these Big Ten powers? It's build that stable of offensive linemen, so guys are playing for the first time maybe at the end of their sophomore year, but then their junior year, or when they're redshirt sophomores, not starting a bowl game as a true freshman and then be expected to be the guy at the blindside spot as a true sophomore.
What stinks, too, is their best offensive lineman prospect enrolled in the spring, Jason Zandamela, did spring practice and then got homesick and then moved to Florida. So we can get on them for not recruiting well enough, but when they did recruit well, their top guy ended up leaving, so that's sort of fickle.
And props to them. I mean, like Elijah Page is a guy that they pried from Notre Dame, and he's supposed to be a big recruit. And I'm not saying that Elijah Page isn't good, and we have confidence that, and Lincoln Riley does too, that he will improve. I just think it's not that USC's doing a disservice, but it's almost a little bit unfair to expect these guys to be fully ready as true sophomores, because you look at some of these other programs that USC's going against with offensive lines that they should respect in a Michigan and a Wisconsin and an LSU. The young guys aren't playing. Like, they are waiting, they are learning, they're not getting thrown into the fire. Alani Noah started the first game of his collegiate career last year in the season opener as a true freshman. That doesn't happen at these other Big Ten programs.
The offensive line needs to be a lot better, and it was bad last year, and it hasn't been good this year. I totally agree. I do think next year, and we're getting ahead of ourselves here, at least I am, they'll probably take a center, I imagine, from the portal, and then hopefully it's Mason Murphy at right tackle, Elijah Page at left tackle, and then Amos and Alani are at the two guard spots. New center, there you go. But we need to see a lot more from Alani Noah, from Amos Talele, from Elijah Page the rest of this year to feel pretty good about that line next year. And I totally agree with you, Jack. I do wish they had more experience on their offensive line, but like, now's the time for these guys. Like, they're thrown into the fire. Let's see what it looks like these next few weeks, and if they can improve, USC will be in a great spot. And if they can't, and they limit USC and they make it so the Trojans, and it's not just one group specifically, but if they're a real weakness and they are pretty clearly the reason why USC doesn't get to the college football playoff, then that's a shame, and we'll hammer the coaching staff and everything accordingly then. But let's let it play out before we get too critical. I'll say the Michigan game, that was terrible. I thought they bounced back pretty well against Wisconsin. Another test against Minnesota. I'm willing to let them kind of sink or swim here going forward, because the team to me is still in a really good spot.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And as long as they play as a group of five, like, I think that's what USC fans should mostly be looking for. You don't need each one of the individual five to turn into, all Big Ten, all American level players. But if they can just play cohesive football on the line, which that seems to be sometimes where the problems are stemming from, if they can do that, that would be a big step. We've got some questions that we've had in the chat, not a ton. So if you guys are still watching on YouTube or Facebook, please feel free to leave some questions, some thoughts. It can be about anything USC. It can be about the game, and we'll be able to answer those. Torian Pratt, Connor on YouTube, says, does USC score 40-plus points?
I'm going to say no. I think, I won't give away my prediction, but I don't know if they'll get to 30 in this game. I think it's a tough environment, and they certainly could, but 40 to me seems a little tough.
I am also going to say no, but I do think they get to 30, and we'll have our score predictions at the end of the show. I know Lincoln Riley's offenses are normally groups that score 40-plus. I just don't know if that's, A, going to happen in the Big Ten as often, and B, I just don't know if that's USC's philosophy anymore. Because I do think when Lincoln Riley sat down this offseason and he talked about making philosophical changes, obviously they have a better defense. So he has already shown this year there are times where he'd punt this year that he probably wouldn't have the last 2 years because he can trust the defense. And I think that he realizes you make it tougher on a defense if you're going up and down the field and just putting them out there and not caring at all about time of possession and field position and anything like that and going for it in your own territory. So I think USC plays a little bit less risky, and I think that means that they score 40 points in fewer games this year.
I totally agree. When you have a good defense, you don't need to win in shootouts. It's nice.
Jasper on YouTube says, are there injury updates on Eric Gentry, Achille Arnold, and one more, Makai Lemon?
Makai looks like he's back, and Achille Arnold, Riley said today we're going to let the injury report speak for that. So Arnold and Gentry are questionable. I don't think Eric Gentry will play. I do think Achille Arnold will play unless he faces a setback here the rest of the week. And Makai Lemon looks like he'll be good to go, too. So I think USC will get 2 of those 3 guys back. But Riley today said wait until the injury report comes out before the game, and that'll be the final call.
Yeah, and if you haven't seen the only USC videos that the athletic department is posting on YouTube, I thought the number one highlight from the one that they posted this morning was Achille Arnold out last week with an injury, a strong safety, goes up to his 2 backups, Bryson Shaw and Zion Branch. He says, take my job. Like, that's how I want you guys to play today. Take my job. Don't let me have it anymore. And I think that's the kind of leadership that in the culture we've been talking about. I just thought that was a pretty emblematic quote from Achille Arnold.
Amazing. Imagine being in that situation. I wouldn't even think about saying that. I'd be like, I want to play.
Torian Pratt on YouTube says, do you think Amari and Peterson will hit the portal with falling behind Brian Jackson after already being in the offense and seeing carries going to the other backs?
It's certainly a possibility. USC only has the 4 running backs, so if one of them gets hurt, it's possible Peterson ends up playing a bigger role later this season. He seems to love USC. I know he's really close with Quentin Joyner, both those guys in the same recruiting class coming from Texas. But, hey, the playing time is the playing time, and we've seen guys who play a hell of a lot more transfer, so it wouldn't surprise me. If I had to guess, I don't really know at this point. I'd want to see what the roster looks like next season, but, I mean, it's certainly a possibility. Jackson's younger than him, playing more already. He really isn't playing all that much. It's definitely possible.
Mark asks, is Minnesota a loud stadium? I want to say it's a newish stadium. I thought I read that somewhere, that it's like semi-new. I've never been, so I wouldn't know.
I've never been either. I feel like a fraud not being able to answer this. I think because it's a night game, like what, 4:30 kickoff Central Time, right?
No, it's 6:30 there, so it's 4:30
okay, yeah,
here.
I keep getting the freaking time zones mixed up. 6:30 there. I imagine college night, like I think it could get pretty loud.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say it's like, it probably doesn't have the reputation of being a super loud, hostile environment, but like if you don't think that the college kids are going to get up for a 6:30 game when USC's coming to town, like they probably will.
There might be some Big Ten people watching this like these idiots. They don't know that Minnesota is one of the louder stadiums. Like, no, we don't. It's new conference.
Yeah. Ronan asked, is Makai Lemon coming back this week? We already touched on that.
So.
It looks like he is. He was back at practice this week, full participation, wearing regular jerseys and practicing with everybody else. Jasper asks, with Rajon Davis redshirting at linebacker, who fills in for him?
Well, he wasn't playing a lot, so we don't know for sure. Desmond Stevens is the backup Mike, but even when Mason Cobb couldn't play, Desmond Stevens did not rep with that top offensive line at all. It was all, well, I guess Cobb's the will, but I forget what I said. What I was trying to say is when there was one injury to a linebacker already this season, instead of playing 3, D'Anton Lynn rolled with 2, so USC will have 2 this week, it looks like. And if another guy gets hurt, that's a good question. It could be Desmond Stevens if it's Easton Mascarenas Arnold. It could be Anthony Beavers. Could be Garrison Madden. We haven't really seen this happen because when there was that one injury to Cobb, they just rolled with 2 linebackers. USC will have 2 against Minnesota. The backup, it's a little fuzzy right now. D'Anton Lynn was asked about it, and he pretty much mentioned everyone. I don't think we'll know that until USC has to either do it or if someone else emerges in practice and they earn more playing time.
Yeah, I think when the reserves went in at the end of the game against Wisconsin, I want to say Anthony Beavers went out on the field, but Desmond Stevens didn't. And I could be wrong. I don't have the participation chart in front of me, but I remember seeing Anthony Beavers out on the field. Prophet Brown came in as the backup nickel. USC got in some of those reserves late in the game. So that could be your answer, is like, who's the guy that D'Anton Lynn wanted on the field, or it could have been a reward thing. It's hard to tell in that situation because USC obviously felt like the game was over, and they had rewarded Anthony Beavers with a captain spot that week. So maybe it was a, hey, you worked hard in practice this week. We want to give you this opportunity. But
yeah, I think it was Stevens and Rajon, right? Both of them. Did Rajon come in at the end?
That's a good question.
Stevens didn't. I have his PFF right here. He only played against Utah State. So I remember seeing Beavers. I'm pretty sure Davis was into. He was a backup linebacker, so it's going to be a reserve guy, whoever replaces him. And I use the word replace. Like, we should be talking about special teams. Who's going to come in?
Yeah, that's good. He had a couple good special teams tackles this year.
Who's going to replace him on special teams? I look more towards that right now than I do linebacker.
Tony, with a great comment, says Minnesota has the newest stadium in the Big Ten, 15 years old, give or take. So I was
well, you nailed
technically right.
Yeah, no, you were right.
Skate for Life says UCLA is a mess. Was Deshaun Foster a good hire?
Don't want to grade him so early, but to me, I was at that Big Ten Media Day when he couldn't get a speech out of his mouth, and I don't know how that could possibly inspire confidence.
We play in L.A.
Yeah, so I watched that, and I was like, okay, I don't think this is going to go very well. And then this year, I mean, it hasn't looked very good, that's for sure. So I don't think so. I think it was kind of a panic move. And going back to what I said about PJ Fleck, he has his faults, but at least you're going to be in the mix for winning 6 to 7 games just about every year, I think, if he's in charge there at UCLA. With Deshaun Foster, he could bottom out real fast.
If you're looking at what's going to be maybe the most lopsided game in the Big Ten this year, or what's got a potential to be on that list, UCLA, playing its third straight top 20 team, goes to Penn State this week. I don't know what time the game is at, but
9 a.m. Pacific time.
So, yeah, that's not... I have a feeling that's not going to go all that well. They played LSU, Oregon, and now go to Penn State, which is definitely supposed to be one of the toughest places to play in the Big Ten. We know that one.
They played freaking Hawaii on the road for some reason. Yeah. I don't know who made that schedule.
Blackie Chan Gaming says, how many snaps do you think Jade Abasiri has? He thinks that Jade gets 20 snaps.
That's probably
that's
too
steep,
many.
I think. I'm going to say 9. That might be even high.
I might say 0 until they say they're going to play him and then they don't. So I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't get in. Well, it is his homecoming. Maybe they'll throw him a bone. But I don't know. I thought he was going to play last week and he didn't. And this week they say we do want to play him more. If those 4 guys are rolling, where it's Clifton, Meyer, and then behind him Tompkins and Kobe Pepe, that's a solid rotation. You can get away with rotating 4 guys in the middle. If someone gets hurt or something, yeah, he could play more. But the fact that he didn't play at all last week kind of made me scratch my head, and I'm skeptical that he will. But if he does get on the field, I'll guess 7.
I think they realize, too, they're on the verge of some of these guys, like, really breaking out. Like, I think they probably think Kobe Pepe is, like, another game or 2 away from really getting the confidence he needs to fully break out. He had the best game of his career against Wisconsin. He had some great plays. They were high on him and what he presents as a physical guy up the middle that has the size that they want to play defensive tackle. So, like, I don't think – it's always hard. Like, true freshmen are true freshmen. And the same conversation we had about the offensive line, you can apply to several other positions. And you don't want to kind of thrust a guy into his main playing opportunity for the first time on the road either. I know it's home for him, but it's like you don't want to send a guy in there that's too juiced that could lead to a big play. Like, I think USC probably doesn't want to take the risks associated with getting a true freshman in there a ton. I definitely don't think he gets to 20 snaps unless USC is playing an insane amount of defense. One of the reasons he might not have played last week, Connor, is because the time of possession battle was so skewed. USC held the ball for 41 minutes in that game. Wisconsin, when it scored, would score on, they had a 1-play drive, they had a 4-play touchdown drive, and then a bunch of 3-and-outs or 4-and-outs. Maybe that's why he didn't play. Like, maybe he's a guy that on longer drives, when the defensive tackles get tired, they run him out for the second series on a given drive, and we just didn't see a lot of those on Saturday.
Great point. That certainly is possible, and yeah, that time of possession sure was lopsided.
Last question comes from Andrew on YouTube. He says, Lincoln Riley said, we're going to do what's best for USC in talking about scheduling. In what world is the Irish not being scheduled the best for USC, or can you shed some light on what he means by it?
Well, I mean, it's It's just the fact that makes the schedule easier and you have an easier chance to make the college football playoff. But I'm with Andrew. I don't want that game going anywhere. I love
no
that
one does.
rivalry. Lincoln might, though.
I don't think he's going to be allowed to do that. That would be my guess. I know USC fans are probably...
He runs the show, man.
I know that USC fans didn't like that he said that at Big Ten Media Day. I like being a student, I didn't like that he said that. I don't think he could ever do that. I think they're so reliant. They're so reliant on boosters and everything in this world of college football. Like, how are you going to alienate that traditional audience that you rely on so heavily?
Well, you say we're going to win a national championship now.
I don't know. I mean, I certainly think that's not the way to go. But like, look at Notre Dame's schedule right now. Because Notre Dame lost to NIU earlier in the year, they have to run the table. They could go 10-2. If they win every other game but lose to USC in the last week of the season, and Notre Dame won't make the playoff. USC can beat Penn State, go and lose to Notre Dame in the last week of the year, have the same record at 10-2, but make the playoff because of the strength of schedule. So I mean, if you're asking in what world is not scheduling Notre Dame better for USC, like, I personally don't think that that's the world.
I totally don't think it's crazy though that like Riley's rationale makes all the sense in the world.
I guess, but like, look what happened to Ole Miss this past week. Like, they played a bunch of nobodies to start the year, played their first real game at home against a Kentucky team that gave Georgia a little bit of a test, but got destroyed by South Carolina. And Ole Miss, having no battle test going into that game, lost at home, and their season might be kind of screwed because of it. Like, you don't want to be a front-running team that plays nobody and then gets kind of smacked and brought back to reality when you finally play a good football team.
I mean, that's true, but if you're in the two major conferences, you're going to just by default play some of those marquee teams. So maybe Ole Miss kind of got too big for its britches and they weren't good enough against Kentucky. That's also a Kentucky team that took Georgia down to the wire. So I hope that game stays, and you will never hear me say, oh, USC should get rid of it. That's not how I feel at all. But Riley's saying it because it gives USC an easier path to the playoff. I totally understand that, and I kind of respect him for being honest. Sometimes he's not the most honest guy in the world, at least there. It's nice to hear some honesty from him.
I think it would really help USC if Notre Dame would just join the Big Ten. If the Big Ten can go out and add Notre Dame, maybe that helps USC a lot. But who knows if that's going to happen. I want to say that with this 12-team college football playoff, the fact that Notre Dame at the very best case scenario, can only be the 5 seed in this college football playoff, or the fact that they could have a schedule like this where they lose one game and they kind of get screwed the rest of the way because of the way that the schedule is set up. I wonder if in coming years you see Notre Dame motivated to join a conference because of the fact that now it's actually something that could help them.
I think it would only be a Super League situation that they'd join. I think it's more likely that the USC Notre Dame game goes away than Notre Dame joins a conference that isn't that Super League. They touch themselves to being an independent. They love that.
Oh, eloquent way to put it. All right. The spread is USC -8 on the road. Connor, which way are you leaning? You and I both picked incorrectly last week, but we had the right process, and I stand by that. Without the football bouncing off of Jacoby Covington's face mask and into the hands of Mason Cobb, you and I are right. Ryan's wrong. Chris is right as well, because we took Wisconsin. I said USC would win by 14, and they ended up winning by, 17? And it was a 16.5-point spread, 15.5. So it was a bad beat on our part. But USC's -8 this week. Where are you leaning?
I'm done fading USC. It's burned me against LSU. It burned me last week. I think they win by 10. I like them 27-17 or 30-20, somewhere in that range. Do I need to give an exact score for an honest prediction? Okay, I guess we can just make our decision based on the spread. But yeah, I think they'll cover the 8. I think it'll be a cleaner operation, especially in the first half, if the offensive line can protect. I guess that's kind of a big if with how they've played, but I do expect them to come in and be locked in. And just the defense gives you a shot every week, Jack. That's the beauty of it. So I like USC to cover the spread this week.
Yeah, I know road spreads are often probably a little lower than you feel they should be because they want to give credit to the home team. I have USC covering. The score I'm leaning towards right now is 34-17. I'll probably talk myself into like 34-20. this is just another one of those teams where I've been so impressed with the USC defense that I don't really see a world in which Minnesota puts up a ton of points. Obviously, the defense last week gave up 21 to Wisconsin, an offense that I think is on par talent-wise with Minnesota, and that included a short field and an 18-yard rushing touchdown on one play. So USC really, when the defense got to go out there for a real drive, gave up 14 points. I don't know if Minnesota threatens them all that much more, and I think that the defense is similar to the Wisconsin defense. Probably a little bit better, and you get the factor of playing at home, and obviously USC had a pick 6 last week, but they also turned it over 3 times in the first half. So just looking at the way I see these two teams trending and the way that they match up, I think USC is the far more talented team, and I think USC gets to around that 35-point mark. I'll go 34. Minnesota, again, it's a team I just don't see scoring more than 20 points offensively against USC, and that's the third week I've said it. Obviously, Michigan had the pick 6, and that propelled them to 27 points, but another one of those offenses, I just don't see them going past 20 points on this USC defense.
Yeah, that's how I see it too with my 30-20 or 27-17 prediction. It's funny how the schedule has worked out for USC with this good defense. All of a sudden, it's not having to win these shootouts. It's our defense can, the USC defense can limit these teams, and then USC with Lincoln Riley, the offensive execution doesn't have to be perfect. Like last year, it needed to be freaking perfect, and in some games it was really good, and it still wasn't enough. Those days are over, and if you're a USC fan, like what Riley said on Trojans Live has to make you feel so good. We can win in a bunch of different scenarios. In the first 2 years, especially at the end of year one and all of last year pretty much, it needed to be outscoring your opponent, and that's no longer the case. And that just by default gives USC a much better chance to win a lot of these games. Feelings are good right now, man. Let's if you're a USC fan, they got to keep this going because good stuff's happening.
All right, I'm going to tell the people what to do. You search up where the meetup is and what time it is tomorrow in Minneapolis. But if you guys have made it this far on the podcast, please make sure you hit the like button, you subscribe, you save it wherever you get your podcast, send it to a friend so that they can hear the preview for USC in Minnesota. If you guys are going to Minnesota to watch the game, Connor's going to tell you where the meetup is.
Friday night at 6 p.m. at Surly Brewing, Surly, in Minneapolis. Come hang and talk some Trojan football with the Peristyle crew. I'm just reading Ryan's tweet. The picture looks awesome. Big TV, really cool brewery, open space. I don't think Ryan even called and said we were coming because it's such an open area. So Syracuse plays again on Friday night. I'm excited to watch that game. I think Oregon-Michigan State is that night. There's one other game in the ACC, I believe. So there'll be some good football, some good guys to talk with. Me, Jack. I think you're going, right, Jack?
I'm probably going, yes.
Me, Jack, Ryan, Shotgun, Chris. Going to be a lot of fun. Hope to see people out there.
Yeah, we had a really fun one in Michigan. There was laser tag. I kind of ate Chris's lunch at laser tag. That was really fun. But yeah, it's always a great time. And the good news is, really good news for USC, road game 6:30 p.m. the next night. So it doesn't really matter how late you stay up on Friday or how many adult beverages you consume, because you can sleep in a little bit on Saturday. Unless you're going to the Mall of America, which we also have to go check out in Minneapolis.
I like to walk around the campuses if we can.
That too.
So hopefully we'll be doing some of that.
Yeah. But thank you guys so much for listening to the podcast. Again, we really appreciate you guys joining us, and we hope that you guys feel informed about the USC and Minnesota game. It's 6:30 Central Time on the Big Ten Network, so if you aren't going to the game, hope you get the Big Ten Network here. It'll be a 4:30 kick on the West Coast. But for Connor Morrissette, I'm Jack Smith. Thank you guys so much for watching Tunnel Vision. We'll be back with a recap show on Sunday night as USC takes on Minnesota on Saturday. See you guys next time.